Today I have with me Jean, who is my gran, who was born in 1948. So in 1968 she would have been a 20-year-old woman and was still at university. My first question is, how were women in the 1960s treated and what were their roles in society?
In the 1960s, women were largely subservient to men. Men had the power and the authority. Women tended to be their secretaries or nurses, or some sort of subservient but useful job. But it was the men who got the good pay and the kudos and the authority and the control. Women, especially at the beginning of the 1960s, were considered that, well, we don't employ them because they're bound to have children and so on. Now, there were some professional women, but in my school, which was a girls' grammar school, and it was a girls' school, and all the teachers were female, but they were not married. So we had Miss Headley, Miss Day, Miss Allen, and so on. So in those days, really, once you were married, you weren't forced to leave a professional job like my grandmother was, but you weren't considered as people to invest in, really, because you were bound to have children, weren't you? And in many ways that was often the case because the pill wasn't available until the 1960s later on. And while I was at university, I think in about 1968, some of us went to a talk on the pill. So women had fewer choices, really. I was very, very lucky that I had a university education because it gave me more opportunities. I didn't get to one of the higher universities, but I went to Portsmouth Polytechnic in 1966 and got an external BA London degree. Entrance qualifications then were quite strict and they meant something. Few people went and we did have grants. Our parents, though, had very few opportunities at all, and they'd have to go to work at 14 or 16, and then there was the war. So society was beginning to change, but it was still very, very traditional. Nuns were some of the few people that had roles, and you'll have heard lots of awful stories about convents and how many of them punished the girls in their care, but they gave them an education. It wasn't always very nice, though. And there were actresses, of course, in the 60s as well. You had Marilyn Monroe, Deborah Kerr, Doris Day, and so on. But here again, although they were on the silver screen, very often they had to sleep with the director or something to get the role in the first place. So once again, men were exerting their control over a woman.
Women are putting themselves out to get where they need to get to.
Absolutely correct, Fabian, yes. Women tended to get voluntary roles if they couldn't get a job, so that they were something a little bit more than somebody's wife or something, you know. And very often it was in the caring type of professions and so on. And there were very, very few women doctors, lawyers, financiers, politicians, anything high up. But society was changing. And the roles were changing as a result. So what I'm saying is a general overview, and it's based on my own experience of being a teenager in the 1960s. But I have to say that what I'm saying isn't necessarily the same as everywhere. I lived then in the southeast of England, so it was nearer London where things were beginning to happen on a big scale, and then it was sort of radiating out from there. But in those days, there were still, as you know, with Dagenham, traditional industries, coal mining, steel works, car manufacturing in the Midlands, factories in the north. So in parts of England, North Midlands, Wales and so on, change would have been slower, in my opinion, to come, because it was still really important that we were producing these things and selling them. This was mostly affecting men, of course, in those industries, but it meant that the women's role was still to support the male and to raise the family. And there weren't many role models for us at all. Things were changing with fashion and general attitude to society, though. You would find that a lot of your rock stars were male, you know, Beatles, Stones, Kinks, loads and loads of them. But interestingly, some of the female role model stars were black soul singers from America, Martha and the Vandellas and the Supremes and so on. So women just were starting to get to realise that there might be possibilities. You know, we had Dusty Springfield and Sandy Shaw and Petula Clark and so on, individuals. But before the 60s, we really didn't have much in terms of television. I didn't have a television until goodness knows when, and there wasn't the same media stuff that we get now. You'd go to the pictures for, you know, knowledge sometimes and films. So there was this great increase in awareness throughout the 60s because, of course, in the 50s we were still getting over the war and money was tight.
Yeah.
And I think rationing didn't stop until 1954. So everything was about earning enough to live on. Whereas in the 60s there was a bit more money and people were beginning to think beyond that. Well, there might be possibilities. And if you could get to university, then you were going because you could possibly gain a professional qualification to get out of this prior business of just being married and that was it sort of thing. So